You'll find your own path, sweetheart. My father said that while handing my brother the keys to a restaurant I'd helped build with my own hands for 11 years. He said it the way you'd say goodbye to someone at an airport, warm, brief, already turning toward the person he was really there for. What he didn't know, what nobody at that table knew, was that I'd already found my path. I just hadn't invited any of them to walk it with me. My name is Theodora Callas. Everyone calls me Thea. I'm 33 years old. I live in Asheville, North Carolina, in a craftsman bungalow on Montford Avenue that I bought with cash in 2023, which still feels surreal to say out loud because 5 years before that I was sleeping on an air mattress in a studio apartment above a laundromat on Haywood Road and eating staff meals because I couldn't afford groceries. I own and operate 3 restaurants. The first is called Sisu, a Finnish word that means something close to inner strength but more stubborn, more quiet, more ancient than that. There's no clean English translation. That's why I chose it. The second is called Valo, which means light. The third, which opened last October, is called Mary, which means sea. Together, they employ 60 people, generate $11.4 million in annual revenue, and have a combined waitlist that stretches 4 months into the future. The Asheville Citizen-Times called Sisu the most important restaurant to open in Western North Carolina in a decade. Bon Appetit included Valo in their 2024 list of America's best new restaurants. And my father has never eaten at any of them. That's not because I haven't invited him. It's because he doesn't think of me when he thinks of restaurants. He thinks of my brother. He always has. Let me go back. My family is Greek-American. Second generation. My grandparents came to the U.S. from a village outside Thessaloniki in 1971 with $400 and a recipe for avgolemono soup that my grandmother could make with her eyes closed. They settled in Hendersonville, North Carolina, about 25 miles south of Asheville, because my grandfather's cousin had a job connection at an apple orchard. Within 3 years, they'd saved enough to open a small diner on Main Street called Callas Family Kitchen. It had 12 tables, a counter with 6 stools, and a menu written in my grandmother's handwriting on a chalkboard that hung behind the register. She cooked. He served. They worked 14-hour days, 6 days a week. On Sundays, they rested. That was the rule. Even God rested on Sunday, my grandmother used to say, so, who are we to argue? By the time I was born in 1992, Callas Family Kitchen had grown. My father, Stavros, had taken over in 1987 when my grandfather's back gave out. He'd expanded the space, added a proper kitchen, hired staff, and turned the diner into a full-service restaurant. 34 tables. 15 employees. A reputation that stretched across Henderson County and into Asheville and Brevard and everywhere in between. People drove 45 minutes for my grandmother's moussaka. They came from Greenville, South Carolina, for the lamb souvlaki. The restaurant wasn't just a business. It was a landmark. It was my family's name, literally, on a sign above the door. And my father guarded it the way some men guard their pride, fiercely, selectively, and with a clear sense of who deserved to inherit it. That person was my brother, Nico. Nico is 3 years older than me. He's 36 now. Growing up, he was the one my father saw when he looked at the future of the restaurant. Not because Nico was more talented. He wasn't. He could cook, sure, the way anyone raised in a Greek kitchen can cook. You absorb it through proximity. But Nico's gift wasn't cooking. His gift was performance. He was loud. He was charming. He could walk through the dining room and make every table feel like they were the most important people in the building. He'd remember regulars' names, their kids' names, their drink orders. He'd joke with the old couples and flirt harmlessly with the church ladies and shake hands with the men who came in after work still wearing steel-toed boots and sawdust in their hair. Nico was the front of house, the face, the air. I was the kitchen. From the time I was 12, I was in that kitchen. Not because anyone asked me to be, because that's where I wanted to be. I'd come in after school and sit on a milk crate next to the prep station and watch our head cook, a man named Dimitri, who'd been with the restaurant since 1994, break down a whole lamb with a boning knife that he sharpened every morning on a whetstone he kept in his apron pocket. I watched him make pasticcio from scratch, layering the bechamel so it's set perfectly, not too thick, not too thin, the kind of precision that looks effortless but takes decades. I watched my grandmother, before she passed in 2008, make phyllo dough by hand on a floured wooden table that was older than my father. She'd stretch it so thin you could read a newspaper through it. I asked her once how she knew when it was ready. She held it up to the window and said, "When you can see the light, it's done." I learned everything in that kitchen, not from a textbook, from touch and smell and sound. The sizzle of onions in olive oil at exactly the right temperature. The way garlic smells 30 seconds before it burns. The sound a knife makes on a wooden cutting board when your rhythm is right, that steady thok that means you're not thinking anymore, you're just moving. I learned to cook the way my grandmother learned, by standing next to someone who knew more than me and paying attention. But my father didn't see it. Or maybe he saw it and didn't value it the same way. In his mind, the restaurant was a stage, and the person who ran the stage was the one the audience saw. Nico worked the dining room. I worked the kitchen. And in my father's hierarchy, the dining room was the business. The kitchen was just the engine. Important, sure, but not the thing you put your name on. When I was 17, I told my father I wanted to go to culinary school. Not just any culinary school. I wanted to apply to the Culinary Institute of America in Hyde Park, New York. I'd researched it obsessively. I knew the acceptance rate. I knew the curriculum. I knew that their certified master chef program was one of the most respected credentials in the industry. I wanted to learn technique, discipline, pastry arts, charcuterie, fermentation, all of it. I wanted to become the kind of chef who could elevate what my grandmother had built into something that reached further. My father's response is burned into my memory the way a brand mark stays on wood. He was sitting at the back booth after closing doing the books. The restaurant was empty. The kitchen smelled like lemon cleaner and the fryer oil that Dimitri always changed on Thursday nights. I sat across from him and laid out my plan. I spoke for about 5 minutes. When I finished, he closed his ledger, looked at me, and said, "Thea, you don't need school for what you do. You already cook fine. And frankly, we need you here. Nico's going to manage the floor, and I need someone I trust in the kitchen. You're that person. Why would you leave? Because I want to learn more than what we do here. What we do here has fed this family for 30 years. I know, and I want to take it further." He shook his head. Not angrily. Sadly. Like I'd said something naive, and he was too tired to argue. "Thea, the restaurant stays in the family. Nico will run it one day. That's how it works. You'll always have a place here. But the business goes to the firstborn son. That's how your grandfather did it. That's how I'm going to do it." He said it like he was quoting law. And in our family, he was. The firstborn son inherits. The daughter supports. The kitchen serves the dining room. The engine serves the stage. I was 17. I didn't have the language to fight it. I didn't have the leverage. I just had a feeling in my chest like someone had taken something that was mine and put it in a cabinet I couldn't reach. I didn't go to culinary school. I stayed. I worked the kitchen through my late teens and all of my 20s. I became the de facto head cook after Dimitri retired in 2016. I ran the line during dinner service. I developed new dishes. I modernized the menu while keeping my grandmother's recipes intact, adding seasonal specials that drew in a younger crowd from Asheville, dishes that blended Greek tradition with Appalachian ingredients. Lamb braised with local sourwood honey. Spanakopita made with ramps foraged from the Blue Ridge. Feta aged in brine infused with mountain herbs from a farm in Marshall. The food got better. The reviews got better. The regulars noticed. Nobody asked who was behind it. They assumed it was the restaurant, the name, the brand. Not the woman in the back with the burns on her forearms and the flour under her nails. In 2020, my father turned 62. He announced his retirement at a family dinner in October. Lamb, potatoes, the good wine, the white tablecloth. He stood at the head of the table, my mother beside him, and he gave a speech about legacy, about his parents, about what it means to build something that outlasts you. Then he looked at Nico and said, "The restaurant is yours now. Take care of it the way I did, the way your grandfather did." He handed Nico a set of keys. Actual keys. on a keychain with the restaurant's logo. Everyone clapped. My mother cried. Nico hugged my father and said, "I won't let you down, Dad." Then my father turned to me. He walked over, put his hands on my shoulders and said, "And you, sweetheart, you'll find your own path. I know you will." He hugged me. It was warm. It lasted maybe 4 seconds. And then he went back to his seat and poured more wine, and the evening continued as if my entire adult contribution to the restaurant had been summarized, addressed, and dismissed in a single sentence. I drove home that night on I-26, the same highway I'd driven 1,000 times between Hendersonville and Asheville. The mountains were dark silhouettes against a sky that was just starting to show stars. The radio was off. The windows were down. The air smelled like October in the Appalachians, wood smoke and decay, and something cold moving in from the ridgeline. I wasn't crying. I was done crying about my father's choices. I'd made my peace with him somewhere around age 25, the way you make peace with weather. You can't change it. You just dress accordingly. What my father didn't know, what nobody in my family knew, was that I'd already been building. It started in 2019, a year before his retirement. I'd been quietly saving for years, living on almost nothing while working at the restaurant. My rent was $700 a month. My car was a 2009 Toyota Corolla with 180,000 miles. I didn't travel. I didn't shop. I cooked at home with ingredients I bought wholesale through the restaurant supplier account, which my father never noticed because I always paid for them separately. By 2019, I had $94,000 in savings. Not enough to open a restaurant in most cities, but enough in Asheville if you knew where to look and weren't afraid of work. I found a space on the south side of the French Broad River, a former auto body shop on Riverside Drive that had been vacant for 2 years. The landlord, an older woman named Beulah Hicks who owned half the block and had been renting to various businesses since the 1980s, gave me a 5-year lease at a rate that was almost charitable. She told me she'd had a feeling about me. I told her I'd had a feeling about the building. It had good bones, high ceilings, a concrete floor that could handle the weight of a commercial kitchen. And it was 3 blocks from the River Arts District, which meant foot traffic from the gallery crowd and the tourist circuit. I spent 6 months building out the space. I did most of the non-structural work myself, painting, tiling, installing shelving. I hired a contractor named Webb, a quiet man from Swannanoa who'd done restaurant build-outs before and who didn't charge extra for the 47 questions I asked every day. I designed the kitchen myself. Every station, every shelf, every hook for every pan was exactly where I wanted it because I'd spent 15 years learning what a kitchen needed by standing in one that was never quite right. I opened Sisu on March 7th, 2020. 12 people came the first night. Friends of friends, a couple who'd wandered in off the street, and a food blogger from Asheville named Waverly who'd seen my soft launch post on Instagram. The dining room was small, 40 seats, but it felt enormous because most of them were empty. I cooked every dish myself. I plated every order. I stood in the kitchen and listened to the sound of forks on plates and conversation through the pass window, and I thought, this is it. This is what it sounds like when something is yours. 2 weeks later, the world shut down. I won't sugarcoat what happened next. It was the worst 3 months of my life. I'd poured everything, every dollar, every hour, every ounce of courage I'd scraped together over 27 years of being the invisible one into this restaurant, and suddenly nobody could come inside. I sat on the floor of the kitchen the first night of lockdown and stared at the ceiling and thought about calling my father and telling him everything, just so someone in my family would know that I'd tried. But I didn't call, because the thought of hearing him say, "That's too bad, sweetheart," would have broken something in me that I needed intact. I pivoted to takeout within a week. I designed a menu that traveled well, things that could survive a 20-minute car ride without losing their soul. Braised dishes, stews, pastries wrapped in parchment. I did all the cooking myself. Greta, my one employee at the time, a pastry chef I'd met at the Asheville Farmers Market who made baklava so good it made me homesick for a kitchen in Hendersonville, she handled the front. We ran the entire operation, the two of us, out of a building designed for 40 seats, serving 60 takeout orders a night through a window we'd cut into the sidewall with a reciprocating saw and a prayer. My hands smelled like garlic and construction dust for 6 straight weeks.
We survived. Barely.
There were nights I counted the register, and it didn't cover the next day's food cost. There were mornings I woke up at 4 a.m. and drove to the restaurant just to sit in the kitchen in the dark and remind myself that the building was still there, that the dream hadn't evaporated overnight. But we survived. And when the world opened back up, Sisu was waiting. The reviews started coming. Small ones first, local bloggers, Asheville food pages, a mention in the Mountain Express. Then bigger ones. A feature in our state magazine. A write-up in the Charlotte Observer. Then Bon Appetit sent a writer in 2022 who spent 3 hours at the bar, ordered everything on the menu, and published a piece titled The Greek Appalachian Kitchen You Didn't Know You Needed. After that, everything changed. By late 2022, Sisu was booked 6 weeks out. I'd expanded to 50 seats. I had 18 employees. Revenue hit $3.8 million. I opened Valo in early 2023, a smaller, more intimate space in West Asheville focused on wood-fired cooking and seasonal tasting menus. It seated 30 and was fully reserved within 2 weeks of opening. I hired a sous chef named Ibtisam, a Moroccan-American woman who'd spent 5 years at a Michelin-starred restaurant in Chicago and wanted to move somewhere she could breathe. She brought a precision and a creativity that pushed my food into places I hadn't imagined. And during all of this, I never told my family. Not once. Not because I was hiding. Because nobody asked. My father called me every Sunday. That was his routine. He'd call, ask how I was doing, I'd say fine, he'd tell me about his garden or his back pain or what my mother was cooking. He never asked about my work. He assumed I was still cooking somewhere, maybe a line cook at someone else's restaurant, maybe catering on the side. He never used the word chef. He never said, your restaurant. He didn't know those words applied to me. Nico called less often. When he did, it was usually to complain. The restaurant's costs were up. The staff was unreliable. The new dishwasher quit after 3 shifts. The food supplier changed their delivery schedule. Everything was a problem. Everything was someone else's fault. I'd listen and offer suggestions, things I'd learned from running my own operation, but I'd frame them vaguely, as if I'd read them somewhere. He never questioned where my advice came from. He just took it and complained some more. What I watched happen to Kalas Family Kitchen over the next 18 months was painful. Not because I wanted it to fail.
I need to be clear about that.
Some people hear this story and assume I was rooting for Nico to crash. I wasn't. That restaurant was my grandmother's legacy. My childhood. The place where I'd learned to cook, to listen, to love food as a language that could say things words couldn't. Watching it decline was like watching a house you grew up in slowly lose its paint, and then its walls, and then its foundation. Nico's first mistake was changing the menu. Not updating it. Gutting it. Within 3 months of taking over, he removed my grandmother's moussaka.
Gone.
22 years of a dish that people drove from 3 counties to eat, erased from the chalkboard like it was a typo. He replaced the lamb souvlaki with a deconstructed gyro bowl that came in a ceramic dish with swirls of tzatziki and microgreens on top, and looked like it belonged on a wellness influencer's Instagram, not in a Greek family restaurant in Henderson County. He added avocado toast to the brunch menu. Avocado toast. In a restaurant whose identity was built on avgolemono and pasticcio. It was like putting a spoiler on a tractor. It didn't make it faster. It just made it confused. He added a brunch service because he'd read somewhere that brunch was the most profitable meal in the restaurant industry, which is technically true if you have the staff and the systems to support it. Nico had neither. He didn't hire additional kitchen staff, so the same 4 cooks who were already stretched thin during dinner service were now pulling double shifts on weekends. The cooks were exhausted. The food showed it. Plates went out undercooked, oversalted, or cold. The regulars started noticing. Then the regulars started leaving. And once regulars leave a family restaurant, they don't come back quietly. They leave reviews. His second mistake was the renovation. He spent $120,000, money the restaurant didn't have, turning the dining room into something that looked like a boutique hotel lobby. New lighting fixtures that cast the kind of moody amber glow you see in cocktail bars in Nashville. New chairs that were beautiful and deeply uncomfortable for anyone over 50, which was half the customer base. A bar made of reclaimed wood from a tobacco barn in Madison County that he described as rustic modern, a phrase that means nothing and costs everything. The renovation was a costume, and the body underneath was sick. The food came out of the same kitchen, on the same plates, made by cooks who were exhausted, underpaid, and increasingly resentful. No amount of ambient lighting fixes a plate that tastes wrong. His third mistake, and this is the one that killed it, was the liquor. Nico had always liked to drink. Growing up, it was social. A beer at a barbecue. Wine at dinner. Normal. It was never a problem until it was. The stress of running a failing restaurant, the pressure of being the chosen son who was supposed to carry the legacy, the slow realization that he was in over his head and too proud to admit it, all of that found its way into a bottle. By 2022, he was drinking during service. Not obviously. Not falling down drunk. Just a bourbon here and there behind the bar, poured into a coffee mug so nobody would notice. Then 2 bourbons. Then 3. Then 1 before the doors opened at 5. The staff noticed. They always do. A waitress named Jolene, who'd been there for 9 years, quietly started looking for other jobs. The sous cook, a kid named Marcus, who I'd helped train before I left, told me later that he'd known it was over the night Nico dropped a plate during service, laughed about it, and went to pour himself another drink while Marcus cleaned up the broken ceramic. By the end of 2022, Kala's family kitchen was bleeding. Revenue had dropped 40%. 3 long-time employees quit within the same month. The Yelp rating went from 4.6 to 3.8. My father, who still drove by the restaurant twice a week even in retirement, noticed the parking lot getting emptier. He called Nico. Nico told him everything was fine. It wasn't. In April 2023, Nico missed rent. The landlord, a commercial property group in Greenville, sent a notice. In June, he missed again. In August, they filed for eviction. In September, Kala's family kitchen closed. 22 years of reputation. 34 tables. 15 employees who lost their jobs, including Jolene, who'd been there since she was 23 and was now 32, with a kid in 1st grade. Including Marcus, who'd been counting on a kitchen career and was suddenly updating his resume at his parents' dining table. A sign that had hung over Main Street since before I was born, taken down on a Tuesday morning by 2 men with a ladder and a drill. The Hendersonville Times-News ran a short piece. 4 paragraphs. The headline said, "Beloved Greek restaurant closes after 2 decades." Beloved. That word hit me harder than anything else. They called it beloved. And the person who loved it most had been given a hug and told to find her own path. My father didn't leave the house for a week. The call came on a Thursday at 2 a.m. I was in bed in my bungalow on Montfort Avenue. My phone lit up the nightstand. Nico's name. I let it ring twice, then answered. Thea.
His voice was thick.
Not drunk. Broken. The kind of thick that comes from crying for a long time in a dark room. Thea, I lost it. I lost the restaurant. It's gone. Dad won't talk to me. Mom keeps crying. I don't know what to do. I sat up in bed. The house was quiet. Through the window, I could see the street, the old oaks, the porch light from the neighbor's house casting yellow shapes on the sidewalk. Where are you? I asked. Home. Sitting in the kitchen. I haven't slept. Have you been drinking? Silence. Then, not tonight. Okay. Thea, I messed up. I messed up everything. I thought I could handle it. I thought I knew what I was doing. But I didn't. I never did. The kitchen, the food, the operations, I didn't understand any of it. I just knew how to talk to people. And when the food got bad, talking didn't matter anymore. I closed my eyes. I thought about my grandmother's phyllo dough, thin enough to see light through. I thought about Dimitri's boning knife and the sound it made against the whetstone. I thought about the back booth where my father had told me I didn't need culinary school because I already cooked fine. I thought about the night I'd driven home on I-26 after he gave Nico the keys, the stars coming out over the Blue Ridge, the air through the open windows, the silence that tasted like freedom and loss at the same time. "Nico," I said, "I need to tell you something." "What?" "I own 3 restaurants in Asheville." The silence on the other end lasted so long I checked to make sure the call was still connected. "What?" he said. The word came out broken like it had been dropped from a height. "Sisu, Valo, and Mary. 90 tables total. 60 employees. $11.4 million in annual revenue. Bon Appetit featured Valo last year. We have a 4-month waitlist at Sisu." "That's not, Thea. That's not possible." "It is. I've been building them for 4 years. I started the year before Dad retired." "Why didn't you tell us?" I took a breath. Here it was. The question everyone in my family would eventually ask, the question that assumed the burden of communication was mine, that it was my job to force information into a space that had never been open to receiving it. Because Dad gave you the restaurant and gave me a hug. Because when I was 17 and wanted to go to culinary school, he told me I cooked fine and should stay in the kitchen where he needed me. Because for 11 years, I was the person making the food that built the reputation he handed to you. And not once, not one single time, did anyone in this family look at me and say, "Thea, what do you want to build?" You all decided I was the engine. Nobody asked if the engine wanted to drive. Nico didn't say anything for a long time. I could hear him breathing. Ragged, uneven. The way you breathe when something is rearranging itself inside you, and you don't have a say in the process. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "I'm so sorry, Thea." "I know. Dad needs to know." "I know that too. Will you tell him?" "When I'm ready." I wasn't ready for another 3 weeks. It was October by then. The mountains around Asheville were on fire with color, reds and oranges and yellows so vivid they looked artificial, like someone had oversaturated the world. I called my father on a Sunday, his usual call day. He picked up on the first ring. He sounded tired, older than 64. The restaurant closure had aged him in a way retirement never had. "Dad," I said, "I need you to come to Asheville." "What for?" "I want to show you something." He drove up the following Saturday with my mother. They parked on Riverside Drive, in front of Sisu, and sat in the car for a few minutes the way they do when they're somewhere unfamiliar. I watched them from the window. My father was wearing his good jacket, the navy one he wore to church and to funerals. My mother was holding her purse with both hands. I met them at the door. The restaurant was closed for the afternoon, between services. The dining room was empty but set, 50 place settings on white linen, glasses polished, candles waiting to be lit. The late afternoon light was coming through the windows, catching the copper fixtures over the bar. The kitchen smelled like rosemary and braised lamb, and the sourdough bread we bake fresh every day in a wood-fired oven I'd had built by a mason from Black Mountain. My father walked in and stopped. He stood in the doorway of my restaurant the way you stand in the doorway of a room you didn't know existed in your own house. He looked at the tables, the bar, the open kitchen visible through the pass, the chalkboard menu on the wall, written in my handwriting, the same handwriting as my grandmother's, looping and certain. "This is yours," he said. "This is mine." He walked to the chalkboard. He read the menu, slowly, the way you read something when you're trying to understand, not just what it says, but what it means. I watched his eyes move across the words. Lamb braised with sourwood honey. Spanakopita with foraged ramps. Avgolemono made from Yaya's recipe, the one she could make with her eyes closed, the one she taught me at this height, standing on a milk crate, reaching for a pot I couldn't lift. His hand went to his mouth. He turned around. His eyes were wet, not the polite dampness of a man trying to hold it together. Wet, full, overflowing. My mother was already crying. She'd been crying since she saw the name on the door. "Thea," my father said. His voice broke on my name. "Thea, why didn't you tell me?" "Because you told me I cooked fine, Dad. You said the restaurant goes to the firstborn son. You said that's how grandfather did it. And then you gave Nico the keys and you gave me a hug and you told me to find my own path. So I found it. I just found it without you." He sat down at a table. Not carefully. He dropped into a chair like the air had gone out of him. My mother sat next to him and held his hand. The restaurant was quiet. The kind of quiet that only an empty restaurant has. The hum of the walk-in cooler, the tick of the clock, the ghost sound of 100 meals that had been served and cleared and remembered. I was wrong, my father said. I was wrong about everything. Not everything, I said. You were right that the food matters. You were right that family matters. You were right that Yaya's recipes are sacred. You just gave the keys to the wrong person.
He looked at me.
And for the first time in my life, I saw my father see me. Not Thea, the kitchen helper. Not Thea, the daughter, who cooks fine.
Me, the chef.
The owner. The woman who took everything he taught her, everything his mother had taught her, everything she'd absorbed through 1,000 hours of watching and listening and burning her hands on hot pans, and built something that was bigger and braver and better than what he'd imagined. Can I eat here? He said. You can eat here anytime. I cooked for them that evening. Just the three of us in a 50-seat restaurant. I made my grandmother's avgolemono, the lemon and egg soup that tastes like childhood, the recipe I'd memorized at 13 and had never written down because some things live in your hands, not on paper. I made the lamb. I made the spanakopita, with ramps I'd foraged that morning from a hillside in Pisgah National Forest. I made baklava the way Greta makes it, with local honey from a beekeeper in Weaverville and pistachios toasted until they smell like warm earth. My father ate every bite. He didn't speak during the meal. When he finished, he set his fork down, looked at his empty plate, and then looked at me standing in the pass window between the kitchen and the dining room, the same position I'd occupied for 11 years at Kalas Family Kitchen, except now the kitchen was mine, and the dining room was mine, and the name on the door was mine. Your grandmother would have been proud, he said. That was enough. That was more than enough. Nico came to Asheville in December. I'd offered him a job, not as a manager, not as a partner, but as a front-of-house host at Mary, my newest location. He'd need to learn the menu. He'd need to learn the food. He'd need to understand that the kitchen isn't the engine. The kitchen is the heart. And everything else, the dining room, the bar, the service, exists to carry the heartbeat to the people at the tables. He accepted. He drives up from Hendersonville 4 days a week. He wears a black apron. He learns the specials every morning by standing in the kitchen at 10 a.m. while Ibtisam walks him through each dish, its ingredients, its origin, and the story behind it. Because at my restaurants, every dish has a story. The lamb is my grandmother's. The ramps are from a hillside I've been foraging since 2020. The bread is from a sourdough starter that Greta has kept alive for 3 years, feeding it every morning like a pet. Nico struggled at first. He's used to being the star, and host work isn't stardom. It's service. It's reading a table and knowing when to approach and when to disappear. It's remembering allergies and anniversaries and the name of the woman's daughter who just got into college. It's everything Nico was always good at, stripped of the ego and rebuilt on a foundation of respect for the kitchen. He's getting there. Slowly. Last week, a customer asked him about the braised lamb, and instead of performing, instead of launching into a story about himself the way the old Nico would have, he said, "My sister developed that recipe. She uses sourwood honey from a farm about 20 miles from here. If you want, I can ask her to come say hello." The customer said yes. I walked out of the kitchen, wiped my hands on my apron, shook the man's hand, and went back to the line. It was the first time Nico had ever introduced me as the person behind the food. Not the engine. Not the background. The person. My father comes to Sisu every other Sunday now. He sits at the same table, the one by the window that overlooks the French Broad River. He orders whatever I'm cooking that day and eats it slowly, the way you eat food when you're not just tasting it but remembering everything it took to make it possible. Sometimes he brings my mother. Sometimes he comes alone. He never sits at the bar. He always leaves a tip that's too large. And every time he leaves, he stops at the door, looks back at the dining room, at the tables, at the chalkboard, at the kitchen where his daughter is standing with burns on her forearms and flour under her nails, and he nods. Once. Slowly. Like a man who has finally understood something that was right in front of him the entire time. The sign above the door says Sisu. But the recipe on the chalkboard says Kalas. And the hands that make it are the same hands that made it 20 years ago, standing on a milk crate in a kitchen in Hendersonville, reaching for a pot I couldn't lift, learning from a woman who held Philo up to the window and said, "When you can see the light, it's done." I can see the light now. I've been able to see it for a long time. The only thing that changed is that everyone else finally looked up. "Not everything," I said. "You were right that the food matters. You were right that family matters. You were right that Yaya's recipes are sacred. You just gave the keys to the wrong person." He looked at me, and for the first time in my life, I saw my father see me. Not Thea, the kitchen helper. Not Thea, the daughter, who cooks fine.
Me,
The chef. The owner. The woman who took everything he taught her, everything his mother had taught her, everything she'd absorbed through 1,000 hours of watching and listening and burning her hands on hot pans, and built something that was bigger and braver and better than what he'd imagined. "Can I eat here?" he said. "You can eat here anytime." I cooked for them that evening. Just the three of us in a 50-seat restaurant. I made my grandmother's avgolemono, the lemon and egg soup that tastes like childhood, the recipe I'd memorized at 13 and had never written down because some things live in your hands, not on paper. I made the lamb. I made the spanakopita with ramps I'd foraged that morning from a hillside in Pisgah National Forest. I made baklava the way Greta makes it, with local honey from a beekeeper in Weaverville and pistachios toasted until they smell like warm earth. My father ate every bite. He didn't speak during the meal. When he finished, he set his fork down, looked at his empty plate, and then looked at me standing in the pass window between the kitchen and the dining room, the same position I'd occupied for 11 years at Kalas Family Kitchen, except now the kitchen was mine, and the dining room was mine, and the name on the door was mine. "Your grandmother would have been proud," he said. That was enough. That was more than enough. Nico came to Asheville in December. I'd offered him a job, not as a manager, not as a partner, but as a front-of-house host at Mary, my newest location. He'd need to learn the menu. He'd need to learn the food. He'd need to understand that the kitchen isn't the engine. The kitchen is the heart. And everything else, the dining room, the bar, the service, exists to carry the heartbeat to the people at the tables. He accepted. He drives up from Hendersonville 4 days a week. He wears a black apron. He learns the specials every morning by standing in the kitchen at 10 a.m. while Ibtisam walks him through each dish, its ingredients, its origin, and the story behind it. Because at my restaurants, every dish has a story. The lamb is my grandmother's. The ramps are from a hillside I've been foraging since 2020. The bread is from a sourdough starter that Greta has kept alive for 3 years, feeding it every morning like a pet. Nico struggled at first. He's used to being the star, and host work isn't stardom. It's service. It's reading a table and knowing when to approach and when to disappear. It's remembering allergies and anniversaries, and the name of the woman's daughter, who just got into college. It's everything Nico was always good at, stripped of the ego and rebuilt on a foundation of respect for the kitchen. He's getting there. Slowly. Last week, a customer asked him about the braised lamb, and instead of performing, instead of launching into a story about himself the way the old Nico would have, he said, "My sister developed that recipe. She uses sourwood honey from a farm about 20 miles from here. If you want, I can ask her to come say hello." The customer said yes. I walked out of the kitchen, wiped my hands on my apron, shook the man's hand, and went back to the line. It was the first time Nico had ever introduced me as the person behind the food. Not the engine. Not the background. The person. My father comes to Sisu every other Sunday now. He sits at the same table, the one by the window that overlooks the French Broad River. He orders whatever I'm cooking that day and eats it slowly, the way you eat food when you're not just tasting it, but remembering everything it took to make it possible. Sometimes he brings my mother. Sometimes he comes alone. He never sits at the bar. He always leaves a tip that's too large. And every time he leaves, he stops at the door, looks back at the dining room, at the tables, at the chalkboard, at the kitchen where his daughter is standing with burns on her forearms and flour under her nails, and he nods. Once. Slowly. Like a man who has finally understood something that was right in front of him the entire time. The sign above the door says Sisu, but the recipe on the chalkboard says Kalas. And the hands that make it are the same hands that made it 20 years ago, standing on a milk crate in a kitchen in Hendersonville, reaching for a pot I couldn't lift, learning from a woman who held Philo up to the window and said, "When you can see the light, it's done."
I can see the light now. I've been able to see it for a long time.
The only thing that changed is that everyone else finally looked up.